Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. On February 18, 1979, residents of Ain Sefra were blown away with something falling from the sky. It was a white, powdery, foreign substance. Yes, I'm talking about snow. But why was this such a big deal in the middle of winter? Well, this town is in the Sahara Desert, the world's hottest desert with average high temperatures of over 100 degrees. That's Fahrenheit for you counting at home. But in the same year, a new hire in the NFL would lead to the league being flabbergasted themselves. Foreign things coming from the sky. Well, a little bit sideways, I suppose, because it might have had something to do with West Coast. And this guest was Hook. That new hire's name was Bill Walsh.
Welcome to the Football History Dude podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean, and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
This time to step off the DeLorean. The date is January 24th, 1982. We're here in the Pontiac Silverdome, a place where yours truly would later venture to and watch his favorite player of all time. I can just hear the chants now. Barry, Barry, Barry. The entire stadium just going wild for Barry Sanders when he just busts loose up the sideline and takes it into the house to only hand the ball off in a nice gesture to the ref. But let's not get ahead of ourselves a little too much here. We're here because, well, think about it. It's late January. It definitely can't be the Lions because they're never making it that far late January. But we're here to watch the first Super Bowl victory of legendary coach Bill Walsh. The reason why we're talking about Bill Walsh has everything to do with this week's guest, Aaron Tallent. We find out that he was a 49ers fan growing up, and much of the content we talk about in this episode actually revolves around this era for the San Francisco 49ers. Now, Aaron comes to us with over 20 years of journalism experience between writing and broadcasting in many avenues, including sports. And more specifically for this show, football history. Now, in this episode, we're going to take an in-depth look at a few of some of Aaron's recent articles, but there's so much more that you can go take a look at over on AaronTallent.com. That's with 2 L's. Now, the articles that we're going to talk about today include the top draft picks at each spot, as in each position, the number of all time, the history of the salary cap, and the top 5 USFL teams of all time. Plus, we're going to sneak a little bit in of his interview with legendary Dan Marino. But before we get into this interview, now is a good time for me to remind you that this podcast is part of something much grander. It's called the Sports History Network, the headquarters for sports yesteryear. Now, we're primarily a podcast network specializing in sports history, but we also have a ton of additional blog articles over on the website. If you're interested in learning more about the network, reading some of the great content we have over there, finding out about our other podcasts, and even joining the email list, the best way for you to do is just straight up head to sportshistorynetwork.com. Again, That's sportshistorynetwork.com. But for now, let's buckle up and get that baby up to 88 miles an hour because we're going to head back in time with Mr. Aaron Tallent. You have the whole shindig. You got to actually have a microphone and the windscreen. I mean, you do a lot of podcasting yourself then?
I have my own Andy Griffith show retrospective podcast called The Loaded Goat. And so each week we break down an episode of the Andy Griffith show. We bring in guests to talk about the history of the show or whatever might tie in with the show. It's also, I don't know how familiar you are with the show, but it's also got a very loyal legion of fans. They're not as much like Trekkies, but it does have a strong following.
I'm not super familiar, but wasn't there an Arnie on there that was kind of a dope, or am I thinking of a different show?
You're thinking of Barney Fife.
Barney?
Yeah, Barney Fife.
Barney Fife. There you go. That's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah. Well, yeah. I've seen it, but I wouldn't be able to get back and tell you all that. It's a very unique niche topic to be able to get into. I mean, like you said, if you have a lot of nostalgia fans, I got to imagine they're all over it.
Well, I'm from Tennessee, and if you grow up in the South, I mean, Andy Griffith is just a way of life. And so the idea is I've seen every episode. I'm a seasoned fan, and my co-host he's a few years younger than me, and he's never really watched the show, and so he's watching it for the first time with me.
Well, that's pretty cool. Yeah, it's you have that history and the fandom versus then he has that. I get to get into it, and you guys can have the different perspectives, which is kind of unique. We're going to get in a little bit of that here with football goes. Of course, my show is mostly football, and let's just start off here with like what drew me into you initially. So I was randomly going through, and like there's this picture on Twitter somewhere where it's like you were sitting next to legendary Dan Marino. I mean, what was that interview for? Like, what kind of, was it an article or something like that?
It's funny. So before I went into just writing full time, I did communications for a medical society. And so I'm always very sympathetic not sympathetic, but always just when a reporter reaches out or a PR person reaches out and pitches me, I'm just always kind of like, okay, let me, you're doing your job. Let me see what, what you've got here. And I'd been communicating with this PR person, and he one day said, hey, we're going to be highlighting this suite that they're going to be putting into the Hard Rock Stadium in Miami in advance of the Super Bowl. And Dan Marino is going to be the person who's going to be discussing it. You can come down. You need to highlight the suite. You need to write about that. But you can also get a one-on-one interview with him and just chat with him about his career and his about what you want to discuss. And so I got to sit down with him for about 15 minutes, which was really cool.
Yeah, that was, I mean, like I said, I saw that photo. I'm like, okay, so this is a guy I got to talk to just in general. But like, what was the one question you asked him that you're like, oh, that's a cool answer?
I mean, a lot of it is, as I will say, when you're speaking with people, they've got the road of telling, they get the same question quite a bit. But one that what was really kind of cool was, the Hall of Fame had just been announced, and so he was really excited that Jim Covert was going into the Hall of Fame. He was really excited about that. We talked a little bit about Ace Ventura. He was like, yeah, I just really didn't want to do it. And one of the other things he'd mentioned was the Spike, the famous Spike play. And I asked him, I said, was it something you just made a decision right at the time? And he said, no, we were thinking about it a few plays ahead. One thing I really regretted drilling down was I asked him a little bit about his time at Pitt, but he had that famous play in the Sugar Bowl where he basically slung it down the field in the final play to win, to beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. And I wish I had had him drill down on that a little bit.
I'll tell you what, we're going to get into this later, so I don't know if you can see this in the screen, but it's a DeLorean.
Oh, yeah.
Premise of the show is we hop in the DeLorean, we go back in time, we learn about the history of the gridiron, and maybe I'll let you borrow it, and you can go back and you can ask Dan that question here down the road.
Well, if you'll hang on with me for just a second, I've got something to show you, so hold on one second.
Oh, nice. I'm excited. Drum roll. I know this is audio only and people can't see it, but then right here, oh yes, he has his own DeLorean.
So I am not as big. I'm not really a major Lego person, but when I saw that the Back to the Future DeLorean Lego set was coming out, I was like, I have to get this, and I ended up building it. They've got all three versions. They've got the 1985 version, they've got the 2015 version, and they've got the Old West version. And you can just kind of switch it out. So I built it, and it's one that I need to go back and fix because some pieces are falling off. But I had a lot of fun working on this.
Oh, that's awesome. That's the first time I had anybody kick back a DeLorean at me. Maybe, I take that back. Jeremy McFarland, I think, had a little DeLorean he showed me, but no one with the massive Lego one like that. I think you one up the host here, so we'll keep going with that. And speaking of one up the host, I mean, you speak about or you write about a wide range of topics. Before we really dive into specifically football, like where can the listener of the show find you? We'll talk about it again at the end of the show.
I mean, the easiest thing to find me would just be to Google Aaron Tallent and Athlon Sports, and that'll take you to my personal page, which has several hundred articles of that I've put together in my I guess now 7 years writing for Athlon.
Wow. So okay, I mean, even on your website with like the whole bio of all the other type of stuff, you have the other, wide range of topics, but what specifically draws you? Okay. What draws you into sports, but more specifically for this podcast, what draws you into maybe the football aspect of it? Growing up or something? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about, growing up in Tennessee. I mean, my dad would take me to, we had season tickets to go see the Volunteers play. And so I just really got into football. But even as a kid, I collected football cards and really got into how much each card was worth. Why is this card worth this much? Because this player had a good year, or this player did not have a good year. And sometimes a card would be a huge, the rookie card would be a huge deal, and then a few years later, it'd be worth 50 cents. So it's just it was based on all of these little different factors. So it was just something I just enjoyed following. And be quite honest with you, at the end of the day, I've covered live sporting events. I'm more at home and more in my wheelhouse, going through old newspaper articles and old books, getting a flavor for what it was like way back when.
Yeah, speaking of going through the old books, the article that we're going to talk about, there's going to be a question in there. I just don't know how you did it all. But did you become a Titans fan as they came in, or is it just, were you a fan of another team already?
Well, I think when in the 80s, when I was growing up, 80s, 90s, it was hard not to be a 49ers fan. I mean, with Joe Montana and Jerry Rice and the West Coast offense, I mean, they were so much fun to watch. The Titans came to Tennessee when I was in college, and it was funny because they moved from Houston. They were in Memphis for a year. Then they played at Vanderbilt Stadium for a year. And then they came in and they switched, and they said, well, they're going to have a new name, and it's the Titans. And people in Nashville and around that area were kind of like, how did they come up with this name? But that first year, they had the Music City Miracle. They were in the new stadium. They made the Super Bowl, and I think they've basically just had a loyal fan base ever since. But I mean, you talk about a team that just their move was kind of all over the place to get to Middle Tennessee. But once they got there, they made the most of that first season, and I think the fans have flocked to them ever since.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I mean, why the Titans? Do you know why they decided on that, or no?
I don't know. The one I'd heard that they were kicking around before then was the Tornadoes, but that year before, a massive tornado hit Nashville, and I think that might have been one of the reasons they pulled back on that.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just Titans, I guess, because it's Tennessee, but I couldn't think of any reason why they're a Titan would make sense, but they got their thing. Then again, why does a Lion make sense? Detroit, you're talking to a Lions fan, so.
Yeah, I mean, and then the Bears, I mean, the Chicago Bears, they've got their name to tie in with the Chicago Cubs.
Yep. It is what it is. I mean, that's how things go. And speaking of the Bears and the Cubs, so they were around back when the original draft was happening back in '36, and that's the first article I want to talk about because you had a massive undertaking. It was this article that, for lack of better terms, you picked the best pick at every position within the draft. The first question I have to ask is, how long did it take you to complete this list?
It took a while. I mean, it took probably to put the list together. So what you do is you go through each draft and you go through, and the first thing you do is you basically, I can just tell you, I did a massive spreadsheet. You go in, you pull all of the Hall of Famers. That's the first thing you do, and you organize them by pick. From there, you go in and then you look at where you don't have Hall of Famers in each pick. You then go in and you find, okay, where I've got the open picks, who made the Pro Bowl with this open pick. And then after that, then you go out and you find, if you have open picks, then you find players who had some sort of respectable career and you add them. And then once you get there and once you have them all lined up in each pick slot, you go through and you just compare their careers one by one and you decide and you make the decision on who was the best pick. I mean, I will tell you on some of these were some of these are like no brainers. Like at 199, you have Tom Brady. Obviously, that is not going to be any sort of controversy at all. For instance, this year I had to add 3 picks to it because last year you had 259 picks. This year you had 262. So going in, and I will tell you, like the first, the one that was probably the most difficult was Donald Igwebuike, who was a kicker for the Buccaneers in the 80s. I obviously remember seeing his football cards when I was growing up, but I remember him when he played. But he ended up basically having, it was in examining their careers, I had to basically compare him to a bunch of people who had similar careers. And I mean, if you look at his career, he basically played for 5 seasons, and his career was cut short because he was indicted in a heroin smuggling plot. He was acquitted for it, but that obviously, when you get indicted in something like that, especially during that period, that can basically bring your career to a screeching halt.
Yeah, that was going to be one of the questions is like because I like that you had a formula. Okay, start here, Hall of Fame, check off the list. If there's no other Hall of Famers, that's an easy no-brainer. But then when you run into, say, 2 or 3 Hall of Famers at the same, especially in the first round, like how did you go about the process of weeding them out, like internally?
So one of the things I will use this as an example is take the number 1 pick. Peyton Manning I have listed as the greatest number 1 pick of all time. But let's compare him to a couple of other quarterbacks who were also the number 1 pick. You got Terry Bradshaw, you've got Troy Aikman. So Bradshaw obviously won 4 Super Bowls, was a Super Bowl MVP twice. You got Troy Aikman. He won 3 Super Bowls, was an Super Bowl MVP once. Manning won 2 Super Bowls, was the first player to do it with 2 different teams, and he played in 2 more Super Bowls. But Manning also he was an MVP 5 times, and he played a long career. He played for was an MVP for playing for 2 different teams. And when you look at the breadth of that career, it's like, it's not really like saying this person had a bad career versus this other person, but it's like, you just say, okay, body of work. What's the most impressive body of work if I'm having to lay it all out on paper? And that's it.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, Tom Brady. That's like the no-brainer, of course. At 199, many people consider the GOAT, right? And you're not going to touch it. But I could see in many, especially near the top of the ranks, like there's legitimate. You could have went flip a coin at that point, or sometimes it's pretty obvious where, well, that dude isn't the guy that's going to make it on here. What about the? I don't know, maybe not Tom Brady. He doesn't count here, but like the one player that you were going through the list and you go, man, dang, dude, this guy went so far in the draft. I didn't even realize it now that I know his career after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. I think there's a number. I mean, like, well, actually, you go one more down. I mean, Bart Starr went at 200, and Bart Starr played at Alabama, but he had a back injury for a good portion of his college career, and he got drafted to the 200th pick because somebody on the Alabama in the Alabama program vouched for him, and that's how he ended up in Green Bay. He's in Green Bay. He's doing fine. I mean, he's on the franchise. He's on the team. He's on the team. And then Vince Lombardi shows up, and Vince Lombardi says, "You're my guy." And so it's just interesting how, but if you don't know that, and if you don't really know what the story is, which is, you're always learning when you're writing these, that at the end of the day, that's the thing is, like, when you see the draft now and you see like the first round, and we put so much of an emphasis on, this person's going here and this person's going there. At the end of the day, there's still so many variables that are going to determine your success. And back then, and back when Bart Starr was getting drafted at 200, it was almost like, I mean, basically it wasn't like they scouted him. They just did it on basically word of mouth, which is kind of crazy when you think about how much goes into it today.
Yeah, and that would have also been, I don't know, instead of round whatever it was, 6 now compared to then, it would have been round like 12 or something like that because of the amount of teams that were not in the league.
Yeah. And so, and it was also it was just a different period. And then there's others where you look at just solid players who got drafted and then went on to have careers, but they were drafted late. And there's other interesting stories. Let's say pick 254 at 1958, the Philadelphia Eagles drafted a tackle from California Polytechnic named John Madden, and he injured his knee in training camp and was never able to play. But while he was rehabbing, he watched game film with Norm Van Brocklin, who Hall of Fame quarterback with both of Los Angeles Rams and the Philadelphia Eagles, and decided he really was into coaching. And, think about how all that worked out.
Yeah. It's just how things fall when you get the chips down. Yeah, we all know that name, John Madden. He didn't even realize that's where he was drafted or anything like that. What about, okay, so obviously, so the eras are going to be different because back, there's an emphasis on running versus passing, or then they change it to the cornerback, all that type of stuff. But if you could pick, I mean, you said 49ers. Are you still a diehard 49ers, or is this like, okay, so there's no allegiance? If let's just pick a team, you pick an allegiance to a team, maybe the 49ers back then, you get the DeLorean, you get to go back, or even through looking at your times. Where's the pick where it's like, man, I really wish they would have taken this player, but then they didn't and they missed out. And then 5 picks later, they could have had that all-stud Hall of Famer.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's the thing about Bill Walsh, is you felt like Bill Walsh didn't really make mistakes like that. I felt like his assessment of personnel was a lot better than mine. But I would say that when you think about some of the, I guess, the defensive players, and you look at it, and I would say that if the 49ers could have figured out a way, if you're not even talking about drafting, but like, let's just say the 49ers and the Dallas Cowboys are going after the same talent in the 90s. Let's put it that way. And so the Dallas Cowboys are putting their franchise together, and you look at the draft. Let's say, what do you think Michael Irvin might have been like in the West Coast offense, running those precise routes and basically being able to just break away because with his strength? That would be something I would have been interested to see. Some of those, some of them would have been really, really interchangeable, I would think. I mean, not interchangeable, but I mean, some of those players that they had, I mean, because you look at how they line up differently. I mean, like, they had, and then they had other receivers and they had other defensive players that would have lined up very well on the 49ers side. I mean, let's be honest. If Charles Haley doesn't have all of his mental health issues, and the 49ers don't just basically trade him to get him off their hands to the Dallas Cowboys, do the 49ers win a couple of those Super Bowls that the Cowboys won? You just never know.
Yeah, I mean, just recently, I'm a Lions fan again. So Stafford goes there, and boom, the Rams win. And that's one of the ones that I looked at that made me shake my head, going, "Oh man!" Back in 2014, I mean, that was a great draft class all around. But the Lions took Eric Ebron, and then it was Taylor Lewan, Odell Beckham, and then there was this guy named Aaron Donald, like 3 picks later that we could have had. Granted, I think at the time we had Sue and Nick Fairley, but hindsight's 2020 as you go.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny. I mean, I was thinking about, I mean, that is the question on like the Lions when they had Barry Sanders. And it seemed like for a few years, they were really making some very sound draft moves. And I think it was 91, they went 12-4 with their run and shoot attack and made it, I think, all the way to the NFC Championship game against the Redskins, if I'm not mistaken. But they scrapped the run and shoot, and they said, we'll get more out of Barry Sanders, and we're going to bring in a tight end. And whatever success they were having just started to peter out. When at the end of the day, I mean, I think Barry Sanders was obviously an amazing running back, but you think about it, if he just had a wide open field, like with the run and shoot attack to kind of make his own, that was probably the way to go.
Yeah, just again, hindsight's 2020, as they say, and
Oh yeah,
we can just sit here as a Lions fan, just wishing and dreaming and hoping. But one thing that did wreck some teams, but some other teams found a way around it, was that salary cap, which is the next article that you brought up. Getting under the cap. Let's take me back to the birth of the salary cap.
Okay. Well, the birth of the salary cap came basically out of the two strikes in the 80s, and there was players wanted their ability to go to be free agents. The league owners did not want the ability basically to end up getting into a bidding war like you saw with the NFL and the AFL. And then finally, in 1992, basically a lawsuit led by Freeman McNeil, who was a running back for the New York Jets, basically said that the current structure violated antitrust laws. And so the NFL Players Association and the team owners basically agreed to free agency in exchange for a salary cap. And that would really to basically keep the competitive balance. And I would argue that it is, if you really are if you're a fan that really just wants your team to be a dynasty and just basically be able to keep players and have them for long periods of time and have great success, and you wanted what the Steelers had in the 70s, maybe the 49ers in the 80s, what the Patriots were just able to do under the current system, then maybe you might be disappointed with free agency and the salary cap. If you just want exciting football and parity in the league, I think this has been the perfect mix.
Yeah, I mean, it helps set it to the Burt Bell any given Sunday, where it's legitimately the teams move around. Sure, you're going to have your dumpster fires and things like that, but from a talent perspective, I mean, you mentioned, I guess we keep going back to 49ers. Didn't even realize it when I first brought this up, but you brought up the 49ers president and CEO, Carmen Policy, and the label or the moniker master of the cap. Like, why do we consider him the master of the cap?
Well, I think he figured out what to do. I mean, first of all, they were already the 49ers were already in an arms race with the Cowboys, and the Cowboys had all this talent, and they were not, and the 49ers had come up short with them 2 NFC championships in a row. 49ers had a lot of aging veterans who could jump ship and could leave. And the 49ers, going into the salary cap, paid their players very well, by all accounts, treated their players very well when they were on the road. I mean, they had that streak in the, I think, late 80s and early 90s where they won 18 road games in a row, which is just unreal when you think about it, when they talk about the difficulty playing on the road. But it was a testament to the team, but a testament to how well they were treated when they flew. I mean, they were one of the first ones to fly, take private jets. I mean, nowadays, like, the notion of a whole team just flying commercial is crazy, but that's some of the things they did back then. And so Carmen Policy, being faced with that, said, I need to figure out how to keep some of my core players. And he came up with a unique way of giving players huge signing bonuses before the cap kicked in, and they weren't going to go against the cap. And then to assemble this roster of veterans in 1994 that included Richard Dent, Ricky Jackson, ultimately Deion Sanders. He came up with some very creative ways to pay them, not necessarily the league minimum, but a smaller salary with a bunch of incentives on the back end. Now, all things being equal, that does come down to obviously mortgaging your future. And I mean, some could argue, you were talking about the Lions, that they basically the Rams basically mortgage their future to win a Super Bowl or maybe another Super Bowl. But that's, that is sometimes the calculated risks that teams are now making under the cap. And the ones that do it the best, I mean, the gold standard is obviously the Patriots, who manages to develop new talent, but also maybe sign that critical free agent when they need to.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a few of the tricks just initially right there. Are there anything that going through your research where it's like, ooh, that's a trick of the trade for getting under the cap that I wasn't aware of?
I mean, the salary cap piece of getting basically taking a huge infusion of cash in 1993 and basically saying, okay, we're going to sign you with a huge signing bonus, and then we're going to keep your salary at this level, but so we can stay under the cap, seemed pretty ingenious at the time. The other thing, I mean, and that in covering the salary cap, that was just kind of surprising to me, is there was a period where they couldn't afford a practice squad. I mean, that's how close they were to the cap. So they had to get stars like Jerry Rice to give up some of their additional money so they could actually have field a practice squad.
Yeah. So I don't know enough about it, but I understand that baseball doesn't have necessarily a true salary cap. Is that still the case? Are you aware?
That is still the case. Yes. They do not have a salary cap. I mean, I think they do have some sort of incentive to, you can't overspend, but I mean, I think there is a certain threshold. I'm not certain off the top of my head. It's not something I've researched extensively. I do know though, but I mean, I think if you can, I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and, I don't know if you had an up close view of the Nationals fire sale last year, but there was the point where the Nationals basically realized they didn't have a team that could compete, and they couldn't. And so it made more sense to just basically unload all of their top tier talent except for Juan Soto. But in the meantime, you had LA, New York, teams that, were kind of in the same position. Well, the Dodgers were actually in a much better position, but the Yankees were kind of in the same record-wise position as the Nationals, but they were buying while the Nats were selling, and I think that's more of an indication of market and what you actually can bring in. And I think if you look at some of the NFL teams, I mean, you have these mid-market teams that are still able to who field competitive teams, in part because they are able, and they're able to do that because they're not finding themselves being outspent by larger franchises. I don't know what it would be like. I mean, baseball is its own unique beast, with each team having their own individual television contracts and benefiting. But I don't know if you'd see something comparable in football, where it's basically the New York teams are spending just New York and LA teams are spending gargantuan amounts of money, and the rest of the other teams are kind of trying to compete. I don't think it would be that way, but I think the salary cap has prevented that from happening.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it earlier there too. It's like they have that shared revenue based on, the whole, like the TV sales and everything from a NFL national level versus just individually. Granted, I know they can make separate money individually and such, but it helps keep the smaller market teams at bay, or not at bay, but to be able to help them rise and to maintain competitiveness amongst the league. And speaking of that money, one of the problems that caused the demise of the USFL back in the 80s. I mean, let's get into that one article, but from you, you're taking a different twist. You're saying, okay, I've got these 5 best teams in USFL history. I'm thinking, let's go lightning round. You can either share 1 or 2 of your favorite story / gridiron knowledge nuggets from each of these teams, and we'll go with the drum roll. The whole I can't do that off my top of my thing, but let's start at number 5. Now, are these in order based on your, like, that's how you would rank them?
Yeah, I mean, and this is a fairly easy one to do. I mean, when it's all said and done, I mean, the the USFL had 3 champions. They only had played 3 seasons. They got 3 champions. So 3 of those teams, what 3 of those teams are going to be. And then in looking at their other seasons, I mean, it looked like 1984 was the best season, I guess, from football from top to bottom. I mean, they had a large number of teams. They had a large number of competitive teams. But yeah, it's just basically going in and looking at their records and their body of work. And ultimately, I mean, if you take the Houston Gamblers, like the 84 Houston Gamblers, what they contributed to the game.
Yeah, I mean, that's your number 5 team. So what's one interesting story or nugget you want to give us from that team?
I mean, they scored 600 points in a season, which, I mean, obviously with 18 games, I mean, obviously that's a little easier to do, but they were one of the first teams to really run and shoot offense. And you had Jim Kelly, who obviously Hall of Famer, and then Richard Johnson and Ricky Sanders, who Sanders definitely went on to have a great NFL career. And they should have gotten farther, but it looks like I was not around for this, but it looks like they just basically gave up they were a high-powered offense, but they did not close the deal and gave up 2 touchdowns against the Arizona Wranglers in the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know much about the USFL because my time on this planet too, I wasn't really there around when that was going on. But as I had this podcast, I started realizing there are a lot of like very good NFL players that were in the USFL at that time. You just mentioned Jim Kelly, for instance. It's like I never would have known that.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because I mean, it's one of those things like, the arms race. I mean, of them being able to go in and just draft and pony up money and pay these players. I mean, that was something that, it was they were playing in the spring and the summer, so it wasn't like they were necessarily, going on television with the NFL in the fall, and so. It could be a viable option for a player to say, okay, I'm just going to take this amount of money. I mean, it was still fledgling, and it was still a bit of a startup in certain ways. I mean, for instance, Howard Schnellenberger won a national championship at Miami, and he basically left right after winning because he was going to be kind of had this kind of almost investment stake in a Miami franchise in the USFL, and that never came to be. So he walked away from what was the team of the 90s, I mean, the team of the 80s and the early 90s, to something that just fell apart.
So you said it was, they pony up. You did that on purpose, right? Because of your number 4 team. We got the 1984 Birmingham Stallions.
No, I would love to say I would love to say I was thinking that far ahead, but no, but no, the Stallions, there were a lot of teams in 1984 that basically, had very successful seasons. I mean, the New Jersey Generals also went 14-4 in 1984, and they had, that was a team that had Herschel Walker and probably what was his finest season in the USFL. And then I just, they were just they had a very good offense, and they were kind of neck and neck with Steve Spurrier and the Tampa Bay Bandits, which was his kind of precursor to the Fun and Gun, which he would, definitely hone at Duke and Florida. And then, they basically lost to the Stars, who ended up winning it all that year. So I thought they jumped out to me.
Well, let's talk about the number 3 team. You have the Baltimore Stars there from 85, was it?
Yeah. And this kind of gives you a sense of where things were going with the USFL. I mean, and I don't know if you've watched the ESPN 30 for 30, Who Killed the USFL, but it was interesting. I mean, they were a team. They obviously produced some good football and people, and they had some solid fan bases, but this gives you a sense of just how fledgling some of this could be. I mean, between the 84 and 85 seasons, 6 teams either folded or merged, and 3 teams had to move. And so, basically the Philadelphia Stars, who were the best, I mean, of all the franchises, they were the best franchise in the history of the USFL in its 3 seasons. But they're finding themselves having to move to College Park, Maryland, with the eventual, and they were hopefully going to move to Baltimore, but needless to say, they struggled. They finished the season 10-7-1, but made it into the playoffs and kind of started playing their best football and won their second straight title. So, and that's, you don't see that happen a lot, where a team basically ends up being forced to move, plays in a college stadium, and still somehow manages to win the league title.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of challenging. I would say that trying to even think of a team that I could compare it to that in recent memory. Yeah, I can't think of any team because never do you really move and then do you have much success? Because typically when you're moving, I guess if recently, the Rams didn't either. I'm going to go ahead and skip on that one. We're just going to go on to number 2 on your list, and my hometown, 1983 Michigan Panthers. What do we have for them?
Well, they had Bobby Hebert, who was he ended up playing several years with the New Orleans Saints after the USFL folded, and they ended up beating the Oakland Invaders in front of what was this is kind of crazy. I mean, it was a crowd of 60,000 people at the Pontiac Silverdome. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at, and that's in the first USFL championship. And he hit, and basically for the win, he hit Anthony Carter, who obviously is a Michigan receiving legend with basically playing for the Wolverines and then later the Minnesota Vikings. But he hit him with a 48-yard touchdown pass with a little over 3 minutes for the win.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the USFL in Michigan, because, we don't have a lot of success with football, but it's just funny because I remember this one guy at work recently when they announced USFL. He just comes in, Michigan Panthers, baby. I'm like, dude, I'm too young to even remember when they were winning. But yeah, they were champions, not your stinking Lions, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, they were that. I mean, and you do wonder if it would have actually, if they'd fostered it, if there would have been an appetite for spring football, and summer football, but I don't know. I mean, it seemed, but I'll say one other thing about the USFL. It was also a period where this would never happen now, but Topps Football actually signed deals with Topps Football Cards actually signed deals with the USFL, and they put out, sets for the USFL in 84 and 85. It was just a different period. I mean, stuff nowadays, I mean, it's almost like if a team launches if you see a new league launch, it will be something where it's just almost treated very much like a little bit of a sideshow. The last time there was a lot of ballyhoo about a league was the XFL, and I think that was because Vince McMahon was at the height of his powers with World Wrestling Entertainment, but that fell flat very fast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, and some of the members of the network won't like me talking about this with the USFL and stuff fall into the wayside, but whenever any new league comes up, I just go, okay, it's more of a matter of who's taking bets. When is it going to fold? Not is it going to fold kind of deal. And unfortunately, it'd be nice to get more leagues out there that had more competitiveness and such like that and more fans. But we'll see. Hopefully one of these days, I guess that the USFL kind of almost treating, or the NFL treating them kind of like a minor league, more like actually promoting them more now. Maybe that'll help develop it and it'll last longer than the other leagues have in the past, so they're not a competition type of deal.
Well, I am very much like take a modest approach. I mean, I am, don't try to be something you're not. I mean, I do think there is an appetite for spring football, and I do think that if you want to play in soccer stadiums or smaller stadiums in the United States and give players an opportunity to participate in a spring league and develop their skills, I think there is something to be said for that. I just don't know what you're going. But you need to basically put it in some markets where there's going to be a big enough fan base to support it, and you need to be realistic about what it's going to do.
Yeah, I think that's part of it is just the realistic, and it's like don't come into it saying we're going to overtake the NFL. Come into it and being we're going to be a partner. That would really help them be able to survive. And this is the last one though. Let's go to the 1984 Philadelphia Stars. They were your top team, so that means they were your best team ever in the USFL history, huh?
Yeah, 16-2, great record. That's nothing to sneeze at. They've got one of the, I think maybe the only Hall of Fame player. Actually, no, they don't have the only Hall of Fame player because obviously the Showboats had Reggie White, but they had one of the few Hall of Famers that played in the league with Sam Mills, who was at linebacker. They were in the top 2 in every major defensive category. And when you look at this, they limited Herschel Walker to 50 yards when they played in the playoffs, and they limited Joe Cribbs, who was also a very good running back, to 72, and they only gave up 20 points over 3 games. That's not 85 Bears territory, but that is definitely some great defense territory.
I wonder if during that time frame, and I think I brought this up on a previous interview, if it was ever considered that people thought the USFL had a chance to survive past those 3 years, but not just that, but to actually compete and then to be consumed essentially like the AFL did, or if it was just like how you and I are thinking a little bit more of the leagues.
Well, I think the one who thought it could do, who you should go big or go home because it could compete, ended up becoming a future president of the United States. So that's so there is that. Donald Trump was the New Jersey Generals owner, and he really was pushing for competing directly with the NFL. And that he was also one of the proponents of fall football. I think he's interviewed in that 30 for 30 and has said, look, it's actually, that's the line. It's called small potatoes. Who killed the NFL? And he said it would, if we'd stayed with the route we were going, it would have been small potatoes. And, I don't know. That's the thing is, honestly, I think the lessons learned from the USFL and the XFL, in my opinion, is you need to be content. If you're going to go into that space, you need to be content with small potatoes.
Yeah, we'll keep all the thoughts about anybody aside, but I'm curious what the general populace thought. Like, if there was enough people that were like, "Man, this thing is going along, and it really could do something," and reminiscent of the ones that maybe lived during the time of the AFL merger, and they thought, "Oh, here's another one," or if it was a general consensus of, "Now that's not even going to happen," kind of deal.
Yeah, I think there was. And I think there was. I think one of the things that is different now than it was in, say, the AFL and the USFL is you take the NFL, especially during the AFL, the time of the AFL, NFL, very much a running league, very much a conservative football league as far as just with excitement. The AFL came along and just did wide open passing attacks, high scoring offenses. That drew crowds, that drew interest, and they were able to immediately get in contract with NBC, which is kind of crazy. USFL came along when the NFL was still a run oriented league. You had passing attacks, but very much a run oriented league. And then to give you a kind of a sense of how the USFL and the AFL, the USFL and the NFL differed, take the 1983 draft. It's always discussed how late Dan Marino ended up going in the draft. And even though he was such an amazing, it was understood what a great quarterback he was. Obviously, he had some reputational issues, some baggage issues, which ended up being kind of, going by the wayside as he ended up having a Hall of Fame career. He ended up going number 1 in the USFL draft. That's how committed that league was to having more of a wide open passing attack and doing greater offenses. Now, NFL offenses are as exciting as they've ever been, and I don't think you're going to, you're going to compete with trying to do more of a wide open, more of a wide open attack. And if you can take a look at the XFL, for instance, in 2001, their whole shtick was we're getting back to, rough blood and guts football, which was kind of almost coming full circle.
Yeah, and then on the business side of it, talking about your salary cap article, once free agency hit and the players had that ability and they had more flexibility to be able to gain the bigger contracts, then it was like, okay, that just takes away half of the reason why players might want to jump ship to a whole nother league and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and one other thing I would just mention is when the USFL came along, they still had the eligibility rule of when you could jump. So Herschel Walker, one of the reasons he bolted to the USFL was he was able to leave after 3 years. The NFL still wasn't allowing that at that point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, that's probably one reason. That's why they're able to get those big. Because nowadays, even if you had a whole bunch of money, there's not going to be that much money out there to be able to get it when the players know they can go. And well, let's go back. Okay, you said Herschel Walker. We got to give you the DeLorean one more time. You can go back to any USFL moment, and you can kind of relive it. I know you said you weren't really like living it back then, but go and live that moment and be part of it.
So if there was a game I could go back to and I could see, it would be this game in 1985 between the Los Angeles Express and the Houston Gamblers. It was between Jim Kelly basically was quarterback for the Gamblers and Steve Young was quarterback for the Express. And it's dubbed as the greatest game no one saw because it was an epic shootout. And the Express led 33-13 with less than 10 minutes to play, but Kelly led the Gamblers on a comeback, and they won 34-33, and that's just kind of crazy when you think about there was a shootout between two Hall of Fame quarterbacks that just took place in the Los Angeles Coliseum, and no one, and it's we would, if it was an NFL game, we would be talking about this. We'd still be talking about it. It would be something like it would be a legendary game.
Yeah, it'd be like last year's Mahomes and Josh Allen, the playoff game.
Which if you were looking at rankings on this last year's playoffs, game for game, I went through this. The most exciting playoffs in NFL history, game for game.
I don't have enough to back it up, but for my experience, yes. I mean, granted, what's it called? Recency biasness, yes, for sure. But it's like almost every game was comeback or overtime, or it's just everything. There was like maybe one or two that were not considered like close games. It was wild this year.
Yeah, it was crazy.
And speaking of that, okay, so you have articles. I mean, again, let's tell the listener one more time where they can find you if they want to see your work.
If you, I'm on Twitter at Aaron Tallent. That's with 2 L's. But if you really just want to pull me up and you don't want to fiddle with a URL, just Google Aaron Tallent, Tallent, and Athlon Sports, and you'll see it'll pull you up to my profile page and my articles.
And even though it's not football related, what's your podcast you have?
Oh, my podcast, The Loaded Goat. It is a retrospective podcast on the Andy Griffith Show. Each week we break down an episode. I'm a Southerner. I'm a huge Andy Griffith fan. Watched it growing up. I'm watching it with a friend who is a millennial who had never seen the show, so he's experiencing it for the first time, and we're breaking it down. And along the way, we have huge fans of the show, historians, and just experts from other walks of life to tie in with the show. For example, on one episode, we brought in a prison consultant who basically advises inmates on to prepare for going to jail. And he basically told us the Mayberry jail has kind of the same rules as a minimum security prison, which is pretty crazy when you think about it.
That's cool to bring it in from all those different perspectives, not just like reliving the show or the episode itself, but getting different viewpoints on everything. Yeah,
it's fun. And you learn, it's fun to hear different perspectives for sure.
All right. So speaking of perspectives and viewpoints, so like we're going to close this out the right way. I'm going to give you the mic, the open air. You get a chance to give the listener your last words of gridiron knowledge nuggets or wisdom for the show.
Oh, wow. Okay. If I was going to say anything about wisdom, what I would say is definitely at the NFL, you were watching probably the most exciting football I think we've ever seen as fans. And I think it is a faster game. It is a fun game. It is a high scoring game, and it is there's basically parity across the league, which is, something you did not see for pretty much the first 80 years of football. So that's something that's very exciting.
There you go. A few specific topics from a dude in the business for over 20 years. Who knows? Maybe we'll get him on the network to start his own show in the future. Maybe you can push him there. He's very knowledgeable and he's well spoken. Perfect fit. I tell you what, if you enjoyed this interview, you should reach out to Aaron on the socials. Again, you can find him by looking up Aaron Tallent. That's Tallent with 2 L's, pretty much everywhere you can find it. And the website, AaronTallent.com. Now, as we transition into next episode, we're officially on the other side of 2 full years where there's been another show on the Sports History Network besides the Football History Dude podcast. That first episode was May 25th of 2020, where Joe Ziemba talked about Mats Tonelli on when football was football. I bring up Joe Ziemba, but there's way too many members of the network to thank without giving you this long list that I have to go through super speedily. So I'll just go ahead and give a blanket statement of how much I'm grateful for every member that we have and every listener and follower we have of the Sports History Network. I mean, it's been 2 years, but we're just getting started. We have over 25 active podcasts on the network right now. We have 30 total. And although it's mostly football, we're branching out into all sports. So if you are interested in starting your own podcast, or you know someone else that you think should start one, maybe that author that's super knowledgeable on some particular sports history topic, but they just aren't ready to jump on the mic, maybe you can nudge them over the ledge. All you got to do is come over to us on the website at sportshistorynetwork.com/join. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.